My husband demanded half my wealth in court, until I slid an envelope to the judge. One look inside, and he laughed in my husband's face. "I'm taking half your millions, including your grandfather's estate," Derek announced with a smug grin, his voice echoing through the courtroom like he was announcing winning lottery numbers. The confidence in his tone made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to remain calm in my seat at the defendant's table. "My name is Anna Caldwell. I'm 43 years old, and I never imagined I'd be sitting in a divorce court in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching my husband of 4 years attempt to steal everything I'd worked for my entire life." Derek sat across the room with his attorney, looking like he'd already won the jackpot. His expensive Armani suit, one I'd paid for, of course, was perfectly pressed, and his dark hair was slicked back in that way that used to make my heart flutter, but now made me sick. "Your Honor," Derek's attorney continued, "my client is entitled to half of all marital assets, including the substantial inheritance Mrs. Caldwell received during their marriage." The lawyer's briefcase was stuffed with documents, all of them outlining how Derek planned to walk away with my grandfather's hard-earned money. I watched the courtroom spectators lean forward in their seats, clearly fascinated by what they assumed would be a massive financial settlement. Some of them were probably calculating the numbers in their heads, wondering how much Derek would walk away with. A few reporters had even shown up, drawn by whispers of a multi-million-dollar divorce case involving a prominent Charlotte businesswoman. The local news had been following my success story for years, the small-town girl who built a tech consulting empire from nothing. Judge Harrison, a distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the initial paperwork with a neutral expression. He'd been presiding over family court for over 15 years, and I imagined he'd seen every trick in the book. But something told me he hadn't seen what I was about to reveal. Derek turned slightly in his chair to flash me what he probably thought was a victorious smile. The audacity of it made my blood boil. This was the same man who used to surprise me with Sunday morning pancakes, who claimed he loved me for my mind and my heart, not my bank account. 4 years of marriage, and it had all been a lie. The courtroom felt suffocating with its mahogany paneling and the weight of legal proceedings hanging in the air like storm clouds. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of Charlotte traffic, people going about their normal lives while mine was being dissected in front of strangers. I clutched my leather purse tighter, feeling the manila envelope inside that would change everything. The envelope that would turn Derek's victory celebration into his worst nightmare. "Mrs. Caldwell," Judge Harrison addressed me directly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Do you have any response to these claims?" I stood slowly, my heart pounding like thunder, but my resolve stronger than steel. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment when Derek's greed would finally catch up with him. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I believe there's something the court needs to see." Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs much earlier in our relationship. Derek had swept me off my feet during a particularly vulnerable time in my life. I just turned 38 and was running my consulting firm, Caldwell Tech Solutions, with tremendous success but little time for romance. My grandfather had been my closest companion until his death 2 years before I met Derek, and I was still grieving his loss when Derek appeared at a technology conference in Atlanta. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely fascinated by my work helping Fortune 500 companies optimize their digital infrastructure. "You're incredible," he'd say, watching me review complex system architectures. "I've never met anyone who understands technology the way you do." At the time, I thought he was impressed by my expertise. Now I realized he was calculating my net worth. Our courtship was a whirlwind of 5-star dinners and romantic weekend getaways to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Derek worked as a regional sales director for a medical device company, but he always seemed to have money for lavish dates. "I believe in investing in the people I care about," he'd say when I questioned his spending. I was flattered by his attention and generosity, not realizing he was already planning his long-term investment strategy. When Derek proposed after 10 months, I was hesitant. My grandfather had always warned me about men who moved too fast in relationships, but Derek was persistent. "Life's too short to wait," he insisted. "I know what I want, and I want you." His proposal was elaborate, a private dinner on a yacht in Charleston Harbor with a string quartet playing our favorite songs. The ring was stunning, probably worth more than his annual salary, though I didn't think about that at the time. My attorney, Victoria Sterling, had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. "Any successful businesswoman needs protection," she'd explained. "It's not romantic, but it's practical." I'd felt awkward bringing it up with Derek, worried he'd think I didn't trust him or that I was more focused on money than love. But Derek's reaction surprised me. He laughed and waved it off like it was nothing. Of course, darling. Whatever makes you comfortable. I'm not marrying you for your money. I'm marrying you for you. He signed the papers without even reading them, joking that love doesn't need fine print. His casual attitude convinced me that my worries were unfounded. It's just a romantic formality, he'd said, scribbling his signature with a flourish. Like promising to love, honor, and cherish, but with more legal jargon. I remembered feeling relieved that he was so understanding, so willing to put my concerns at ease. Victoria had been thorough in crafting the agreement, protecting not just my existing assets, but any future inheritance or business growth. Your grandfather's estate will eventually come to you, she'd reminded me. This ensures it stays in your family where it belongs. At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Now, I realized she'd been absolutely prophetic. The real shock came 2 years into our marriage when I received the call about my grandfather's estate. He'd left me everything, his house, his investments, his collection of vintage cars, and $3.2 million in carefully managed funds. It was far more than I'd ever expected, and the inheritance transformed my financial situation overnight. Derek's reaction to the news had been telling, though I'd missed the significance at the time. His eyes had literally lit up when I told him about the money. $3.2 million, he'd repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Anna, we're rich. The way he said, "we" should have been my first clue. From that moment forward, Derek's spending habits changed dramatically. He quit his job within 4 months, claiming he wanted to explore new opportunities and be there to support my success. What he actually did was spend my money like it was his personal trust fund. He bought a Mercedes-Benz AMG, supposedly for networking purposes. He invested in a friend's craft brewery without consulting me, losing $45,000 when the business failed within 8 months. He booked expensive vacations to Napa Valley and Martha's Vineyard, joined an exclusive golf club in Myers Park, and started dressing like he'd always been wealthy. Every time I questioned a purchase, he'd remind me that we were partners and that married couples should trust each other with financial decisions. We're building a life together, he'd say. This is what successful couples do. The breaking point came 8 months ago when I discovered Derek had been telling people at the country club that the inheritance was family money that belonged to both of us. He'd started introducing himself as a tech investor and entrepreneur, conveniently forgetting to mention that all his investments were made with my grandfather's carefully preserved wealth. When I confronted him about his lies and his reckless spending, Derek became defensive and then cruel. You act like it's some big secret that I married up, he'd snapped. Everyone knows you needed someone like me to enjoy life. Before we met, you were just a lonely workaholic with no social skills. His words cut deep because there was a grain of truth in them. I had been lonely, and Derek had brought excitement and companionship into my previously work-focused life. But I realized he'd been playing a long game, positioning himself as my savior while systematically planning to claim everything I'd inherited. The final straw came when I found emails between Derek and his attorney discussing divorce strategy. They'd been planning this for months, timing it to maximize his potential settlement. Derek had even researched North Carolina's divorce laws, looking for ways to claim that his emotional support and lifestyle contributions entitled him to a larger share of my assets. In one particularly damning email, Derek had written, "The inheritance came during our marriage, so it should be fair game. Plus, I gave up my career to support her business. That has to count for something substantial." That's when I'd finally contacted Victoria again and filed for divorce myself. I refused to let Derek control the narrative or the timeline. If he wanted to fight over my grandfather's money, I'd give him a fight, but it wouldn't go the way he expected. The months leading up to today's court date had been filled with Derek's increasingly desperate attempts to intimidate me into settling out of court. He'd sent flowers with notes saying he missed me. He'd shown up at my office building, claiming he wanted to work things out. He'd even had his mother call me, crying about how heartbroken he was. But I knew the truth. Derek wasn't heartbroken about losing me, he was panicked about losing access to my money. Now, standing in this courtroom, I was ready to show Derek and everyone else exactly what his greed had earned him. I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope that Victoria had prepared for this exact moment. The courtroom was completely silent except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Derek's confident expression faltered slightly as he watched me approach the judge's bench. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and clear, I believe the court needs to review this document before proceeding with any asset division discussions. Judge Harrison extended his hand and accepted the envelope. What is the nature of this document, Mrs. Caldwell? It's a prenuptial agreement, Your Honor. One that my husband signed before our marriage 4 years ago. The change in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and electric. Derek's attorney, a thin man named Robertson, shot up from his chair like he'd been struck by lightning. Your Honor, we were not made aware of any prenuptial agreement. This is highly irregular procedure. Sit down, Mr. Chun, Judge Harrison commanded, already breaking the seal on the envelope. I'll examine the documents and determine their validity. I returned to my seat, keeping my eyes focused on Derek. His face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching panic in the span of 30 seconds. He was whispering frantically to his attorney, gesturing toward the judge's bench. I could make out fragments of his urgent words, she never mentioned. And how is this possible? Victoria Sterling, my attorney, remained perfectly calm beside me. She'd been preparing for this moment for months, ensuring every detail of our strategy was foolproof. Just watch, she whispered to me with a small smile. Judge Harrison was a thorough reader, taking his time with each page of the agreement. The document was comprehensive. Victoria had made sure of that 4 years ago. It outlined exactly which assets were protected, which debts would remain separate, and most importantly, how any future inheritance would be handled. This appears to be a properly executed prenuptial agreement, Judge Harrison announced after several minutes of careful review. It's dated 8 weeks before your marriage, witnessed by 2 notaries, and signed by both parties. Derek's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. I realized that Robert Chun had filed this divorce case without doing basic due diligence. He'd assumed, just like Derek, that the marriage was a straightforward asset grab. Your Honor, Derek suddenly stood up, his voice cracking slightly. I need to see that document. I don't remember signing anything like that. The judge's eyebrows rose at Derek's outburst. Mr. Caldwell, please remain seated and allow your attorney to handle these proceedings. But Derek was spiraling now, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling like a house of cards. Anna, what is this? You never told me this was some kind of legal trap. Mr. Caldwell. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. You will remain silent or I will hold you in contempt. Your attorney may request to review the document through proper channels. Robert Chun approached the bench with obvious reluctance. I watched him examine the prenuptial agreement, his face growing paler with each page. He returned to his table and began whispering urgently to Derek, who was shaking his head in disbelief. The courtroom spectators were now fully engaged, sensing that something dramatic was unfolding. I could hear muffled conversations and the scratching of reporters' pens as they tried to capture every detail of Derek's public humiliation. This was just the beginning. Your Honor, Robert Chun finally addressed the court, his voice notably lacking its earlier confidence. My client would like to request a brief recess to review these documents more thoroughly. Judge Harrison checked his watch with deliberate slowness. Mr. Chun, did you not conduct discovery regarding potential prenuptial agreements before filing your asset claims? The attorney's silence was answer enough. Derek had been so confident in his strategy that he'd never even mentioned the possibility of a prenup to his lawyer. Robert Chun had been blindsided just as much as his client. I'll give you 15 minutes to review the document, Judge Harrison declared. But I should warn you that this appears to be a legally binding agreement that significantly impacts your client's claims. During the recess, I watched Derek and his attorney huddled in intense conversation near the courtroom windows. Derek's gestures were becoming more animated and desperate as Robert explained the implications of the prenuptial agreement. Even from across the room, I could see the exact moment when Derek realized his plan had completely backfired. Victoria used the time to review her own notes and prepare for what she knew would be Derek's last-ditch attempts to challenge the agreement. He's going to claim fraud or duress, she predicted quietly. Men like Derek always blame everyone else when their schemes fall apart. She was right. When court resumed, Robert Chun immediately launched into a desperate legal argument. Your Honor, my client believes he was deceived about the nature of this document. Mrs. Caldwell presented it as a romantic formality, not a comprehensive asset protection agreement. Judge Harrison looked distinctly unimpressed. Mr. Chun, are you claiming your client signed a legal document without reading it? Your Honor, my client trusted his wife to be honest. He believed she was being transparent about the document's scope and implications. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Derek had always prided himself on being a sharp businessman, someone who could read people and situations. Now his attorney was arguing that he was too trusting and naive to understand a legal contract. The document is clearly labeled as a prenuptial agreement, Judge Harrison observed, flipping through the pages. It includes standard warnings about seeking independent legal counsel. Did your client choose to waive that right? Robert shuffled through his papers nervously. Yes, Your Honor. My client waived his right to independent counsel. And the document was reviewed by a notary public, with your client present and confirming his identity? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Harrison turned his attention directly to Derek. Mr. Caldwell, when you signed this document, did anyone force you to do so? Were you under any kind of duress or coercion? Derek's face was red with embarrassment and anger. No, Your Honor, but I thought it was just paperwork. Anna made it sound like it didn't matter. Did you read the document before signing it? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Derek looked around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable for everyone present. Mr. Caldwell, I asked you a direct question. I skimmed it, Derek finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But Anna said it was just a formality. Judge Harrison's expression was a masterpiece of judicial disapproval. Mr. Caldwell, you signed a legal document without reading it, after waiving your right to legal counsel, and now you're asking this court to invalidate it because you didn't take it seriously? The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, mesmerized by Derek's public humiliation. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching him squirm under the judge's scrutiny. The golden boy who had charmed his way through life was finally facing consequences for his actions. Your Honor, Robert made one final desperate attempt. Perhaps we could argue that the agreement is unconscionable given the disparity in. Mr. Chun, Judge Harrison interrupted sharply. Have you reviewed the financial disclosures included with this prenuptial agreement? Robert flipped through the document again, clearly searching for something he'd missed. There are extensive financial disclosures here, Your Honor. Indeed, there are. Mrs. Caldwell provided complete documentation of her assets, income, and expected inheritance. Your client signed acknowledgments confirming he reviewed and understood all financial information. This is one of the most thorough prenuptial agreements I've seen in my 25 years on the bench. Derek looked like he was about to be sick. The golden boy who had charmed his way through life was finally facing a situation that couldn't be sweet-talked or manipulated away. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and began reading directly from the prenuptial agreement, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Section 4, Paragraph A. All assets owned by either party prior to marriage shall remain the separate property of that party. Section 4, Paragraph B. Any inheritance received by either party during the marriage shall be considered separate property and shall not be subject to division upon divorce. Derek's face went through a spectrum of colors, red to white to green. He gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles turned white. That can't be legal, he muttered loud enough for several people to hear. Section 6. Judge Harrison continued, addresses spousal support. Quote, neither party shall be entitled to alimony or spousal support from the other, regardless of the length of the marriage or the disparity in income. This section was initialed by both parties and witnessed separately. Robert Chun was frantically taking notes, probably trying to find any possible loophole or technicality. But Victoria had been too thorough 4 years ago. Every potential challenge had been anticipated and addressed. Your Honor, I stood up, if I may address the court? Proceed, Mrs. Caldwell. When I inherited my grandfather's estate 2 years ago, I consulted with my attorney about whether the inheritance was protected under the prenuptial agreement. We confirmed that it was fully covered under Section 4, Paragraph B. The inheritance has been kept in separate accounts and has never been commingled with marital assets. This was the final nail in Derek's coffin. Not only was the prenup ironclad, but I'd been scrupulously careful about keeping the inheritance separate. There was no way for him to claim any portion of it. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Mrs. Caldwell, Did you use any portion of your inheritance for marital expenses or joint purchases? No, Your Honor. I maintained my regular business income for household expenses. The inheritance has remained completely separate. Derek exploded. That's not true. She bought things for us. She paid for vacations. Mr. Caldwell. Judge Harrison's voice was ice cold. You are out of order. Sit down immediately. But Derek was beyond reason now. His carefully constructed facade had completely crumbled. This is insane. I've been with her for 4 years. I supported her emotionally. I gave up my career. You quit your job to spend my money, I said quietly, unable to help myself. Mrs. Caldwell, Judge Harrison warned, but his tone was almost amused. Robert was tugging on Derek's jacket, trying to get him to sit down and stop making things worse, but Derek was in full meltdown mode, his true nature finally showing through. She trapped me. Derek shouted. She made me think we were partners. She let me believe that money was ours. Mr. Caldwell, if you cannot control yourself, I will have the bailiff remove you from my courtroom. The threat of being physically removed finally penetrated Derek's rage. He sat down heavily, his chest heaving with angry breaths, but the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom had seen his true character, the greedy, entitled man who had married me for my money and then had the audacity to act like a victim when his plan failed. Judge Harrison reviewed the final pages of the prenuptial agreement with deliberate care. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife as everyone waited for his ruling. I felt a calm satisfaction settling over me. After months of Derek's manipulation and lies, the truth was finally coming to light. Based on my review of this prenuptial agreement, Judge Harrison announced, I am ready to render my decision on asset division. Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Derek with an expression that could have frozen fire. Mr. Caldwell, this prenuptial agreement is valid, comprehensive, and legally binding. You are entitled to exactly nothing from your wife's premarital assets, inheritance, or business holdings. The words hit Derek like physical blows. His mouth fell open, and he stared at the judge in complete disbelief. Nothing, he whispered. Nothing, Judge Harrison confirmed. Furthermore, according to Section 7 of this agreement, all debts incurred individually by either party remain the responsibility of that party. Mrs. Caldwell, do you have documentation of debts incurred solely by your husband? Victoria handed me a thick folder, which I passed to the bailiff. Yes, Your Honor. Credit card debts, the Mercedes loan, the failed brewery investment, and country club fees totaling approximately $94,000. Derek's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The case he'd thought would net him a substantial fee had turned into a complete disaster. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Harrison continued, not only will you receive no assets from this marriage, but you remain personally responsible for $94,000 in debt that you accumulated during the marriage. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. I could hear someone behind me stifle a laugh. Derek had gone from expecting millions to facing bankruptcy in the span of an hour. Your Honor, Derek's voice was barely audible, this can't be right. 4 years of marriage has to count for something. Judge Harrison's smile was razor-sharp. It does count for something, Mr. Caldwell. It counts as an expensive lesson in reading legal documents before signing them. And then, something unexpected happened. Judge Harrison actually chuckled, a low, amused sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Several spectators joined in with barely suppressed laughter. Derek's face turned an even deeper shade of red as the reality of his complete humiliation sank in. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. The court grants the divorce petition filed by Mrs. Caldwell. No assets shall be transferred to Mr. Caldwell. All individual debts remain with the party who incurred them. This court is adjourned. Derek sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation sank in. He'd spent 4 years positioning himself for this moment, only to discover that his plan had been doomed from the day he casually signed the prenuptial agreement without reading it. People began filing out of the courtroom, but I remained seated, watching Derek's world collapse around him. Robert Chun was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to escape this professional embarrassment. Several reporters approached me for comment, but Victoria intercepted them with practiced efficiency. Anna, Derek called out as I finally stood to leave, his voice cracking with desperation. We need to talk about this. This isn't over. I turned to face him one last time, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Derek, it was over the moment you decided to marry me for my money instead of loving me for who I am. The prenuptial agreement didn't ruin your plan. Your greed did. His face crumpled as the full weight of his situation hit him. No inheritance, no assets, and crushing debt that would follow him for years. The man who had charmed his way through life had finally met a situation that couldn't be sweet-talked or manipulated away. As I walked toward the courtroom doors with Victoria beside me, I felt lighter than I had in years. The nightmare was finally over, and Derek's true nature had been exposed for everyone to see. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came with its own sense of poetic irony, and occasionally, even a judge's laughter.